The air in the backstage holding room was thick with the smell of old wood, nervous sweat, and lemon-scented polish. It was a smell she knew well, the smell of every backstage everywhere, but today it felt heavier, like a blanket. She could hear the murmur of the crowd in the main hall, a low, restless ocean of sound seeping through the heavy velvet curtains. Her fingers, resting lightly on her knees, traced invisible patterns on the black fabric of her performance dress. 4 steps from the chair to the water cooler. 18 steps to the edge of the curtain where her guide, a kind and quietly anxious competition volunteer, stood waiting. She had mapped it all when they arrived, her mind building a blueprint of the space through sound and touch and the subtle shifts in the air against her skin. Her name was Ilara, and she was 17. The Grand International Piano Competition was the biggest, most terrifying stage she had ever approached. She wasn't just playing for a prize. She was playing to prove, once and for all, that she belonged here. That the music wasn't something outside of her, but something that lived within, in a place no one could see. She adjusted the simple silver bracelet on her wrist, a gift from her father. It was cool and smooth, a tiny anchor in the storm of her nerves. Out in the vast hall, the last notes of the previous competitor had faded. The applause was polite, a gentle wave that rose and fell. She heard the host's voice, amplified and echoey, announcing her name and her piece. Beethoven's Piano Sonata, No. 23, the Appassionata. A tempest in musical form. Her guide, a young woman with a soft voice, gently touched her elbow. "It's time," she whispered. "I'll lead you to the bench and then step away." Ilara stood, her posture straight. She didn't need to be led to the piano itself. Not really. They had practiced this. The guide walked slowly, and Ilara's hand rested lightly on her arm, not for support, but for direction. They passed through the heavy curtain, and the sound of the audience changed. It was closer now, a living, breathing entity of thousands of rustling programs, quiet coughs, and expectant silence. The stage lights were a physical warmth on her face and shoulders. She could feel the immense space opening up in front of her, a void defined by its echoes. Her guide stopped. "The bench is right here," she said softly, positioning Ilara's hand so her fingertips brushed the cool, polished wood. "Good luck?" And then she was gone. Her footsteps retreating on the hollow stage floor, thought this was the moment of vulnerability. Every person in that hall was watching the blind girl in the simple dress find her way onto the piano bench. She knew what some of them were thinking. She'd heard the whispers her whole life. Asterisk, how can she play what she can't see? It's a pity. Such a brave attempt. Asterisk, she pushed those thoughts away. The piano was her world. She knew this specific instrument, a magnificent, recently tuned Steinway concert grand from the 2 hours she'd spent with it yesterday, exploring its touch, its weight, its soul. She ran her left hand lightly along the fallboard, finding the smooth curve, then let her fingers drift down to the keys. They were cool and perfect. She settled on the bench, adjusting its height by memory of her request, and placed her feet on the pedals. She took a deep, silent breath, drawing the music up from inside her, preparing to launch into the sonata's dark. Powerful opening, but the sound that broke the silence wasn't the first thunderous chord from her finger's dot. It was a voice. A man's voice, rich with a Russian accent, dripping with an arrogance so casual it was chilling. It boomed through the hall, clear as a bell. His microphone, meant for private comments to the other judges, was live. The entire audience heard it. "This is a competition of profound artistry," the voice said, the tone bored, dismissive. "Not a charity ward." A frozen, horrified gasp swept through the crowd. Ilara felt it like a physical chill. Her hands, poised over the keys, went perfectly still. The voice continued. a cruel, rhetorical question thrown to his fellow judges. What can one who has never seen a sunset, never witnessed storm clouds gathering over the mountains, possibly tell us about the tempest in Beethoven's Appassionata? This is not interpretation. It is imitation. At best, the words hung in the air, poisonous and huge. Alara recognized the voice. She had listened to his recordings for years. Maestro Gregor Volkov, a legend, a titan of the piano, a man known for his technical perfection and his scorching, often brutal criticism. To him, she was not a musician. She was a charity case. A sightless girl pretending to understand a storm. A scorching heat rushed to her cheeks. It felt like every light on stage had been focused into a laser, burning her where she sat. The vast, attentive silence of the audience had curdled into something else, a pitiful, embarrassed hush. She could feel their collective wince. She could hear a few scattered, shocked murmurs. Someone shifted uncomfortably in a creaking seat. For a second, the blueprint in her mind, the map of the stage and the hall, completely dissolved. She was adrift in a black, humiliating void. Her first instinct was to flee, to stand up, to feel for the edge of the bench, and to walk off the stage as quickly and with as much dignity as she could muster. The hot prickling behind her eyes threatened to become tears. Never seen a sunset, the phrase echoed. He was right, in the most literal, brutal sense. She hadn't. The colors of a sunset were just words to her orange. Pink, purple, beautiful sounds with no picture attached. But then, as the wave of shame crested, something else rose to meet it. It started deep in her stomach, a hard, hot kernel of defiance. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was a pure, stubborn refusal. A memory flashed, not of sight, but of touch. Her father's hands, large and calloused from his work in the piano repair shop, guiding her small fingers over the internal workings of an old upright. "Asterisk, you see my heart?" he would say in his warm, rumbling voice. "Asterisk, this hammer here, it's the heartbeat. The string, that's the voice. You don't just play the notes on top. You have to feel the life inside the box." Asterisk, she had never seen a cloud. But she knew the feeling of the air pressure dropping before a storm, the electric tingle on her skin. She knew the sound of wind, not as a howl in the distance, but as 100 different textures as it rushed past her ears, through trees, against windows. She knew the chaos of a downpour, the shocking, random percussion of it on the pavement, on the roof, on her own outstretched palm. Her Appassionata was built from that, from the seismic rumble of the subway under her feet, from the terrifying, exhilarating loss of balance in a strong gust of wind, from the feeling of her own heart, thundering against her ribs in moments of fear or joy. Volkov saw music. She felt it. He observed storms. She lived inside them. Her spine, which had begun to curl in on itself, straightened. She lifted her chin. The heat in her face cooled, replaced by a steady, clear focus. The humiliated girl was receding. The musician was taking her place. She let her fingertips, which had hovered stiffly above the ivory, settle onto the keys. They were still cool. They were real. This instrument, this moment, this injustice, they were all real. She didn't acknowledge the comment. She didn't turn her head toward the judge's table. She gave the audience no sign she had even heard the cruel words. She simply took another, deeper breath, this one filling her lungs with purpose. The hall was still paralyzed in awkward silence, waiting for her to either break down or run. Alara Morgan chose a third option. She began to play. The first notes she played were not the ones written in the famous opening of the Appassionata. They were lower, quieter, a deep, rumbling murmur in the bass, like distant thunder heard through the floorboards of an old house. It was a moment of suspension, of drawing the audience into her darkness before the storm broke. In that brief, haunting prelude, her mind was not in the grand concert hall. It was far away, in a small, cluttered apartment that always smelled of dust, lemon oil, and sawdust. She was a child again, maybe 6 years old. The world was a tapestry of sound and texture. Her father's piano repair shop was on the ground floor, and their home was directly above it. Her playground was not a park, but a wonderland of broken and waiting instruments. While other kids learned shapes and colors from picture books, Ilara learned geometry from the skeleton of a grand piano. Her father, a man of few words but immense patience, would lift her up and sit her on the workbench. "Listen," he'd say, his voice a gentle vibration she felt through the wood. He would pluck a string inside an open piano. Twang. That's a lonely sound all by itself. Then he would fit the hammer back into place and press a key. The same note rang out, but fuller, warmer, housed in its wooden body. That's the same voice, at home. You see? She didn't see, but she understood. Her fingers, small and curious, would explore the forest of tuning pins, the soft felt of the hammers, the gritty roughness of the iron harp. He taught her to feel the tension in a string, to sense when it was tight and true or loose and sad. Music, for her, began not as pretty notes on a page, but as a physical, mechanical miracle. It was cause and effect. You press here, and a tiny hammer flies there, and a sound is born. It was magic you could touch. Her father knew she would never read sheet music in the conventional way. So he found another way. He got the sonatas she loved transcribed into Braille, but that was just the map. The journey was something else. He would play a phrase for her, just a few bars. Then he would take her hands and place them over his on the keys. "Feel it," he'd murmur. "Not just the notes. Feel the weight. Here it's heavy, like you're pushing through mud. Here it's light, like you're dropping a feather." He taught her dynamics not as piano or forte, but as close and far. A soft passage was a secret being told right next to your ear. A loud, crashing chord was a shout from the top of a distant cliff. The swell of music rising was the feeling of an elevator lifting in your stomach. The Appassionata, when he first introduced her to it, wasn't a story about a storm. It was a series of physical sensations. "This part," he said, playing the furious running passages in the first movement, "this isn't rain. This is your heart beating too fast when you're scared. It's the feeling of tripping and trying to catch yourself." He played the slow, solemn second theme. "And this is that quiet after you've been crying. Everything is tired and still." Her world was built from such translations. A sunset wasn't colors. It was the day's heat leaving the pavement, the sound of birds settling, the long shadows that made the air feel cooler on her skin. A gathering storm was the eerie silence when the birds stopped singing, the smell of wet concrete before the first drop fell, the pressurized feeling in her ears. When she finally learned to play the Appassionata, she wasn't trying to paint the picture for others. She was trying to survive the emotional weather inside it. As she grew older, her talent became impossible to ignore. Her teacher, a retired concert pianist who had come to the shop to fix a precious keyboard, heard her practicing one afternoon and stood in the doorway, motionless, for 20 minutes. He took her on, not as a charity case, but as the most gifted student he had ever encountered. He refined her technique, polished the edges, but he always said her core understanding of the music was something he couldn't teach. It came from a different place. "You hear the spaces between the notes," he told her once. "Most of us just hear the notes." The path to the grand international competition was paved with doubt from others, but not from those who knew her. There were judges at smaller contests who praised her remarkable effort. They used words like inspiring and brave, which she learned were often codes for good. For someone like you. She felt the condescension, like a faint, sour smell in the air. It never broke her, but it built a quiet wall of determination inside her chest. She wanted to be judged only on the sound. Only on the music that came out of the piano. Now, on the biggest stage of her life, that wall had been smashed open by a single, vicious sentence from a man whose opinion could shape careers. Asterisk Charity Ward. Never seen a sunset. Asterisk, as her left hand held that deep, rumbling note, and her right hand began the fateful, twisting theme of the first movement. She poured every memory, every translation, every felt sensation into her fingers. The fast, anxious passages with the pulse of the city around her, the frantic, unseen energy of crowds and traffic. The powerful chords were not lightning in the sky. They were doors slamming, or the jolt of a train starting, or the sudden, shocking crash of a wave against rocks she could feel through her bare feet. She played for the little girl in the dust-filled shop, learning that music had a heartbeat. She played for her father, who spoke in feelings instead of pictures. She played for every person who had ever patted her on the head and said, inspiring, with a pitying smile. But most of all, in that first, furious minute, she played for the arrogant man at the judge's table. She wasn't trying to prove him wrong. That was too small a goal. She was going to show him an entire world he was blind to. She was going to play a storm so real, so physically felt, that he would forget all about the clouds he could see, and finally feel the rain. The first tentative notes of the sonata's main theme spilled from the piano, and they were not what anyone expected. They were not loud or bombastic. They were searching, uncertain, like the first few, scattered drops of rain that tap against a window, warning of what is to come. Ilara's head was tilted slightly, her face a mask of deep concentration. She wasn't performing for the audience anymore. She was following a path only she could feel, a path laid out in memory and sensation. The audience, still reeling from the cruelty of the public insult, held its collective breath. They had expected her to either freeze or to come out fighting with a blast of sound, a musical shout of anger. This quiet, deliberate beginning threw them. It forced them to lean in, to listen closely. The terrible, awkward silence in the hall began to transform, pulled by the gravity of her music into something else. A deep, shared focus. In the judge's box, Maestro Volkov sat with his arms crossed. His initial expression, one of cold impatience, had tightened into a faint frown. This was not the imitation he had predicted. This was peculiar. He watched her hands, expecting technical flaws, a hesitation that would confirm his bias. But her fingers, though they moved with a different physicality than he was used to, found their mark with a clean, unwavering precision. Then, the music began to build. The scattered raindrops gathered into a patter. The left hand started a restless, churning rhythm low on the keyboard, a gathering energy. It didn't sound like a piano trying to be an orchestra. It sounded like a heartbeat quickening, like the anxious thrumming in your chest when you know something big is coming. Elira's body began to move with it, not with theatrical sweeps, but with the natural, inevitable motion of someone being moved by a force from within. A slight sway forward as the pressure increased, a small recoil as a chord resonated. She wasn't thinking about the notes. She was remembering. The memory wasn't a picture. It was a full-body experience from 2 years ago. She'd been walking home with her teacher after a lesson when a summer storm had caught them by surprise. There was no warning thunder, just a sudden, shocking deluge. 1 second the air was warm and still, the next it was a roaring, wet chaos. Her teacher had shouted, grabbing her hand to run for cover, but for a few breathtaking seconds, Ilara had stopped. She had stood in the middle of the sidewalk, head lifted, and simply felt it. The rain wasn't gentle. It was a million tiny cold impacts on her scalp, her face, her arms. It was deafening, a roar that swallowed all other sound. It was the smell of wet asphalt and soaked earth exploding into the air. It was the terrifying, exhilarating feeling of being completely at the mercy of something vast and powerful. That's what her hands were channeling now. The running passages in the treble became that relentless, stinging downpour. The deep, rumbling bass notes were the thunder she felt in her bones, not as sound, but as vibration through the soles of her shoes. She played the chaos, the overwhelming sensory overload of being inside the storm, not watching it from a safe distance. The music swelled to its first great climax, a crashing wave of sound. Alara didn't just play the chords. She threw her weight into them, her shoulders dipping, her whole body becoming part of the instrument. The sound that erupted from the Steinway wasn't just loud. It was dense, layered, almost violent in its emotion. It wasn't anger. It was something pure, raw, untamed power dot in the front row. A woman who had been dabbing her eyes with a tissue after Volkov's comment slowly lowered her hand, her mouth slightly open. A man who had come to the competition out of duty, already planning his escape at intermission, found himself sitting up straight, his program forgotten in his lap. They weren't just hearing Beethoven. They were being shown a storm from the inside out. They could feel the spray, the disorientation, the wild energy. Volkov's crossed arms had loosened. His critical gaze had shifted from her hands to her face. He saw no sign of theatrical effort, no look-at-me expression. He saw only a profound, all-consuming immersion. She wasn't performing the Appassionata. She was enduring it. And in doing so, she was making the familiar piece utterly unfamiliar to him. He knew every note, every marking on the sheet music. He had performed it 100 times. But this was a version carved from different materials. It felt more elemental, less like a story about passion, and more like passion itself. Made into sound, the furious first movement drove forward, a runaway train of emotion. Alara's technique was flawless, but it was the intention behind every note that began to cast a spell. The quiet moments weren't just soft. They were intimate, fragile, like the calm eye of the hurricane. You could have heard a pin drop in the hall. The loud moments weren't just noisy. They were cataclysmic, shaking the very air in the room dot as she approached the end of the movement. Something happened in the audience. The collective pity and embarrassment had completely evaporated. It had been replaced by something far more powerful. Awe. They were no longer watching a blind girl. They were witnessing an artist of staggering conviction. The label, the disability, the cruel words, all of it fell away, stripped bare by the sheer force of the music. Alara launched into the final, driving passage, the storm reaching its peak. Her fingers were a blur, but every note rang clear, a torrent of perfectly controlled fury. And then, with 2 final, hammer-like chords, it was over. The sound didn't fade. It was severed. Cut off. Absolute silence. It was a different silence than before. Before, it had been stiff with shock and second-hand shame. Now, it was deep, resonant, and full. It was the silence of thousands of people having the breath knocked out of them, all at once. No one clapped. No one moved. They were still trapped in the world she had built, stunned by the emotional journey. Alara's hands fell from the keys into her lap. She was breathing heavily, spent. The storm had passed through her, and she was left in its quiet aftermath on the stage. She did not bow. She did not turn. She simply sat there, gathering herself, alone in the vast, echoing quiet she had created. In the judge's box, Maestro Volkov did not move. His pen, which he had been holding poised over his score sheet, lay forgotten. The sheet was blank. He had not written a single word of criticism. He was simply staring at the young woman on the stage, his face pale, his usual mask of superiority completely gone. For the first time in perhaps 40 years, Gregor Volkov had nothing to say. The teacher had been silenced by the student. The man who had seen everything had just been shown something he truly, fundamentally, had never seen before. The silence wasn't empty. It was full. It was heavy with the echo of the last, shattering chords, and thick with the shock of what everyone had just experienced. It stretched for 1 second, then 2, pressing down on the concert hall. Elara sat perfectly still on the bench, her hands resting lightly in her lap. The storm had passed through her, and she felt hollowed out, quiet. She could hear her own heartbeat slowing in her ears, a soft, private rhythm against the vast public quiet. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the hall, came a single, sharp sound dot. It wasn't a clap. It was a gasp that turned into a sob, quickly stifled. The sound seemed to break a spell. A man near the front, his face wet with tears he hadn't noticed, stood up. He didn't mean to. It was as if his body acted on its own, pushing him to his feet. The rustle of his clothing was loud in the hush dot. Then, to his left, another person rose. A woman, then another and another. It was like watching a wave begin far out at sea. There was no coordinated moment, no cue. It was a slow, rising tide of humanity, people getting to their feet one by one, then in groups, then in sweeping rows. The sound of it was a massive, rustling sigh, the sound of 2,000 people being moved, literally and physically, from their seats. And then the sound broke dot. It started as a rumble, a collective release of breath that became applause. But it wasn't the polite, patterned applause of a competition. This was something raw and emotional. It was thunderous. It was a roaring, weeping, cheering wave of noise that hit the stage like a physical force. People were not just clapping. They were shouting, stamping their feet on the wooden floor, creating a percussion that vibrated up through the legs of the piano. The air itself seemed to shake. Elara flinched, just a tiny movement of her shoulders. The sheer volume of it was overwhelming. It was louder than the music had been. For a moment, she was disoriented. The sound came from everywhere, a roaring ocean of approval that washed over her. She turned her head slightly, a faint, uncertain frown on her face. She had heard applause before, but never like this. This wasn't for a performance well done. This was for a truth told. This was an eruption. On stage left, her guide from earlier was crying openly, her hands pressed to her mouth as she stood in the wings. One of the stage technicians, a gruff older man who had seen 100 competitions, was wiping his eyes with the back of his grease-stained hand, looking up at the rafters as if embarrassed by his own reaction. The focus of the entire hall, however, began to shift. From the weeping, cheering audience to the stunned young woman on stage, and finally, inevitably, to the judges' table. The television cameras, sensing the story of a lifetime, swiveled silently. They found the other judges first. The elderly French composer was on her feet, applauding with a slow, deliberate respect, tears tracing lines through her powder. The American conductor was standing, clapping vigorously, a look of stunned joy on his face. The British critic was nodding, as if a profound question had just been answered for him. And then there was Volkov. He was the only one still seated. He looked like a man who had been struck by lightning. All the color had drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, waxy shade. His famous, imperious posture was gone. He was slumped slightly in his ornate chair. His hands were on the table in front of him, but they weren't moving. They lay flat, palms down, as if he were trying to steady himself or keep the world from spinning. His eyes were fixed not on Elara, but on the space just in front of his own hands. He stared at the blank score sheet, at the expensive pen laid beside it, as if they were objects from a foreign country whose purpose he could no longer remember. The roar of the crowd seemed to exist in a different dimension from him. He was trapped in a profound, silent bubble of his own making. His mind was a riot of noise, but it was the noise of his own words, playing back to him with brutal, new clarity. Asterisk Charity Ward. Never seen a sunset. Asterisk. He had listened to her play, and he had not heard a single note of imitation. He had heard a depth of understanding that terrified him. She hadn't played the storm he saw in his mind's eye, the romantic, picturesque tempest of the Swiss Alps. She had played the storm inside the human soul. The chaos of fear, the violence of grief, the clean, terrifying fury of being misunderstood. She had played with a physicality that was almost painful to watch, because it was so obviously real. Every chord had come from a place of true feeling, not from intellectual interpretation. He, Gregor Volkov, the guardian of profound artistry, had reduced a young woman to a single limiting characteristic. And in doing so, he had revealed his own profound limitation. He had been blind to everything but the surface. He had judged the vessel and had been utterly unprepared for the ocean it contained. A camera zoomed in on his face, broadcasting it to the live feed and to the large screens hanging in the hall. The audience, following the gaze of the lenses, began to notice. The applause didn't die, but it changed. It became mixed with murmurs, with pointed looks. The tension returned, but it was a different kind now. It was the tension of a world waiting for a verdict, waiting to see if the Titan would fall, or if he would dare to speak again. Volkov slowly lifted his gaze from the table. He didn't look at the cameras. He didn't look at his fellow judges. He looked across the space of the stage at Alara. She had finally risen from the bench. She stood beside the piano, small and alone in the spotlight, her head tilted as she listened to the roaring crowd. She looked neither triumphant nor vengeful. She looked finished, peaceful even, as if the music had said everything that needed to be said. Seeing her like that, so composed in the center of the hurricane he had helped create, was the final blow. A shudder went through him. He pushed his chair back. The legs screeched on the wooden floor of the judge's platform, a tiny, ugly sound lost in the applause. He stood up. The crowd noise dipped sharply. A wave of shushes swept through. Now, everyone was watching. Volkov did not applaud. He did not smile. He simply stood there, facing the stage, his hands hanging at his sides. Then, with a stiffness that spoke of a great internal struggle, he gave a single, slow, deep nod. It wasn't a bow. It was an acknowledgement. A surrender. It was a maestro recognizing a master. He held the nod for a long 3 seconds. Then he turned, without a word to anyone, and walked off the side of the judge's platform, disappearing into the dark shadows backstage. He left his score sheet, his pen, and his dignity behind. His exit was more powerful than any applause he could have given. The message was clear. There was no judgment left for him to make. She had rendered it irrelevant. The silence that followed his departure was brief, but electric. Then, as if a dam had burst, the applause roared back, even louder, more emotional than before. It was a celebration, not just of music, but of a seismic shift. A world had just been shattered, and in the space where the old rules had been, something new and breathtakingly honest now stood. A young woman, her hand lightly resting on the piano for balance, simply waited for the storm of adulation to spend its force. The roaring of the crowd was a wave that went on, a force of nature as powerful as the music that had created it. Alara stood beside the piano, her fingers just brushing its smooth, cool edge. The sound washed over her, a physical pressure of warmth and noise. She gave a small, polite bow in the direction she felt the audience to be, her movements automatic, her mind somewhere else entirely. She was exhausted, emptied out. The guide from the wings appeared, her touch gentle on Ilara's arm, and led her off the stage. The applause followed them, chasing them into the shadows. Backstage was a cocoon of chaos. People were talking over each other, their voices high with excitement. She heard the words historic and unbelievable. And did you see Volkov's face? Hands touched her shoulders, patted her back. Someone pressed a cold bottle of water into her hands. Her teacher was there, his voice choked, saying, "You did it. You really did it." But it all felt distant, like listening to a radio playing in another room. The real world, the tactile world, was the memory of the keys under her fingers. The vibration of the final chords still humming in her bones. She didn't win the competition. When the final scores were tallied hours later, after all the other pianists had played their pieces, the official result was announced. She had placed third. There were murmurs of outrage in the hall, but Ilara, sitting in a quiet room with her father and teacher, just nodded slowly when they told her. She understood. The rules of the game were what they were. It was about a complete program, about consistency, about 100 political and personal factors she couldn't see and didn't care to navigate. The gold medal went to a brilliant technician from Korea who had played a flawless, powerful, and utterly conventional program. He deserved it by the rules they had all agreed to play by, but the world, it seemed, was playing by a different set of rules now. Someone had recorded Volkov's comment and her performance on a phone. The video was grainy, shaky, but the audio was clear. The cruel, booming voice, the tense silence, and then the volcanic response of her music. It was uploaded, and within hours, it was no longer just a competition moment. It became a story. The story of the arrogant maestro and the blind girl who silenced him with genius. News sites picked it up. Classical music forums exploded. It was shared by people who had never listened to a sonata in their lives, captioned with words like karma and the student becomes the master. By the next morning, her quiet life was gone. Interview requests flooded in from major newspapers and television shows. Offers arrived, not just for more competitions, but for real professional work. A major record label wanted to record her Appassionata. A world-renowned conductor invited her to perform with his orchestra. The voicemail on her teacher's phone was full. The story had transcended music. It had become about prejudice, about hidden potential, about the power of art to shatter expectations. Ilara accepted the recording contract. She turned down most of the interviews. She didn't want to be a talking point. She wanted to be a musician. She went home, back to the familiar smells of her father's shop, and tried to find her center again in the world of felt hammers and steel strings. Years passed. She worked. She grew. She toured, her performances marked by that same intense physical connection to the music. She never spoke publicly about Volkov. When interviewers asked, she would say simply, "That was a long time ago. I prefer to talk about the music we are making now." She wasn't being generous. She was being honest. That day had been a door swinging open, but she had walked through it into a vast landscape. And she was too busy exploring to keep looking back at the door. Then an invitation came for her solo debut at Carnegie Hall, the biggest stage of them all. It was the final, unquestionable seal on her career. The night was a blur of heightened senses, the particular smell of that hall, the feel of its legendary acoustics, the electric buzz of a sold-out, expectant crowd. She played a demanding program, ending, as she often did, with the Appassionata. This time, it was different. It was richer, deeper, tempered not by defiance, but by a hard-won understanding. The storm was still there, but now she understood its purpose, its place in the wider world. The applause was, once again, a thunderous, standing ovation. Back in her dressing room afterward, floating on a wave of exhausted happiness, there was a soft knock on the door. Her manager poked his head in. His voice was unusually hesitant. "There's someone who would like to see you. He insists it will only take a moment. I can send him away if you're tired." Before she could answer, a figure appeared in the doorway behind her manager. He was older, much older than in the videos she had heard. His posture was still straight, but it seemed held up by willpower alone. His hair was pure white. He carried a small, wrapped package. It was Gregor Volkov. The room went very quiet. Her manager looked nervously between them. Elara, sitting before her mirror, sensed the shift in the air, the hesitation in her manager's breathing. "It's all right," she said quietly. "Please, come in." Volkov stepped inside. The door closed, leaving them in the quiet, flower-scented room. He didn't speak for a long moment. He just stood there, as if remembering how to begin. "Your performance tonight," he said finally, his accent still thick, but his voice softer, worn like an old stone. "It was even more complete. You have grown." "Thank you," she said, turning her chair to face the direction of his voice. Another silence. It wasn't hostile. It was heavy, full of the unsaid years. "I have carried that day with me," he said, the words seeming to cost him something. "Not a day has passed. I have not heard my own foolish words. I judged the cover of a book I could not read." He took a step closer. "You asked, with your music, a question I could not answer. What can one who has never seen a sunset know of a storm?" He paused. "You answered it. You know more than any of us, because you do not look out at the storm. You feel it within. You are the landscape." He held out the wrapped package. "This is not an apology. An apology is too small a thing. It is an acknowledgement." Elara took it. The paper rustled as she unwrapped it. Inside was a book, thick with a soft leather cover. She ran her fingers over it and felt the familiar raised dots of Braille. She traced the title. It was a first edition of Beethoven's sonatas, transcribed for the blind. "A rare and precious thing. I have spent these years trying to listen," Volkov said, his voice growing even quieter. "Trying to hear the spaces between the notes, as you do. You were the teacher on that stage. I was the blind one." Elara closed the book, holding it in her lap. She felt no surge of victory. She felt a strange, deep sadness for him, and a thread of connection. They were both musicians, after all. Both prisoners and servants of the same beautiful, demanding truth. She looked up, a soft, forgiving smile touching her lips. "Maestro," she said, and the old title felt right, a recognition of his journey, not his former arrogance. "We all have our limitations to overcome. Thank you," she added, her fingers resting on the Braille, "for helping me shatter mine." He understood. Her limitation hadn't been her sight. It had been the world's belief that it was a limitation. His cruelty had been the hammer that broke that shell, setting her free. He gave another of those slow, deep nods, just as he had years before from the judge's table. Then, without another word, he turned and left, closing the door softly behind him. Elara sat alone in the quiet room. The smell of stage makeup and flowers in the air. The distant murmur of the departing crowd like a faraway sea. She held the precious book to her chest. The story that had begun with a public shattering had ended, not with more noise, but with a quiet gift in a silent room. The music had done its work. It had changed 2 lives, and in doing so, had reminded the world that true vision has nothing to do with eyes, and everything to do with the heart that listens.